do you need to track calorie expenditure meticulously, right? Because we've basically been talking about a calorie equation, the calories in, calories out equation, and we've been talking about it from the perspective of like, let's manage these different things to manage the calories inside of things, right? But what about the calories outside of things, right? And there are various apps, trackers, even like, something like counting your steps, like all of these different things, like they are ways of tracking your calorie output, right? Now, none of them are all that accurate. Like they can be quite accurate. Like we've been kind of trialing the Whoop. I've found that to be remarkably accurate in terms of like how much my calorie expenditure is at, in terms of like if I eat the calories that it says my weekly average is at, I'm like my weight maintains. So some of them are pretty bang on, right? And some of them are pretty off. However, like I'm never going to use Whoop, here, or some calorie tracker. Like I also have an Apple Watch, I'm not going to use that to be like, this is how I am overall modifying my diet, right? And I'm definitely not going to be using it from a perspective of like, oh, this is my day to day, right? This is today I only burned 2,000 calories, so I'm only allowed to eat 2,000 calories, right? I'm definitely not doing that, right? However, it is a great tool, or it can be a great tool for keeping you on track with a lot of stuff, especially the non-exercise activity thermogenesis stuff, like the fidgeting, the steps, that kind of stuff, right? Because most people overestimate how many calories they actually burn in a training session, a gym training session at least, and underestimate how many calories they actually burn day to day when they're actually active versus when they're not active, right? Like I was only talking to another client about this, and they were saying that, oh, like I've gained weight and I'm doing the exact same stuff that I've always done. What's the story here, right? And I was explaining to them that it's like, you have gained weight because there was a few events that you went to that you overconsumed calories, alcohol, etc., right? So there was a bump in calories in general, right? And you were effectively exercising or moving at maintenance. So you are not ever digging into what you've added. And this is how people add weight over years. Like their, energy expenditure stays remarkably similar, but what happens is, Christmas time, different events, they'll eat more, and all of a sudden they gain 5 pounds, 2 kilos, whatever it is, right? And they'll never actually dig into that. They'll never actually chip away at that, right? They'll always just have that 2 kilos until the next event where they gain another kilo or another 2 kilos, and their activity stays remarkably similar, right? So they're like, I'm still getting my 10,000 steps per day or whatever it is, but it's like, you are effectively exercising at maintenance. You're not ever exercising above and beyond, or you're never actually eating in a deficit, right? And so a calorie tracker can be really good for that. It can be a great tool for estimating, we'll say, calorie expenditure day to day. It can definitely be a great tool if you are doing like mixed activities, like, as I said, like myself and Gary, we do like jujitsu and resistance training. Gary also does some jogging occasionally, I believe. So for that, it's like, it can be very hard to understand your caloric demands without a lot of trial and error. So it can be a fantastic tool. However, I'm not doing something like integrating MyFitnessPal and my Apple Watch or something like that, because people do this all the time where they're like, they get their exercise burn and it'll modify their calories on MyFitnessPal, and that's just not a beneficial strategy overall. I just wouldn't do it. Do not integrate the two of them. It actually makes everything so much more complicated. I would not be modifying my day-to-day intake based on my day-to-day expenditure. We want to look at averages, right? The only time I would say I would caveat that with, okay, you can change it on a day-to-day, is if, your activity on that day is actually just wildly above and beyond what it normally is. Like normally you get 7,000 steps, and one day, I don't know, you're in London, right? And you're like, right, I'm actually just going to walk around. I want to visit, different places, and you're not using the tube, for example. And then all of a sudden you're at like 30, 40, 50,000 steps. Like you easily could get that in a big city, walking around versus getting like public transport, right? So if you're going from 7,000 steps to 50,000 steps, I'm like, there's obviously going to be a difference in your calorie expenditure, right? But I wouldn't be modifying it on the day to day in general. Like it's just, it makes things far more complicated. Would you agree with that, Gary?
I'd agree with all of that.
Fantastic. Well, I have nothing else to say really. Yeah, calorie tracking for the diet, it's not necessary. There are other methods. Calorie tracking for expenditure, it can definitely be helpful for understanding your overall expenditure on a given day, on a given week. But realistically, we need to look at this stuff in terms of averages. So I wouldn't be using that calorie data to modify day-to-day stuff. I would be using it, looking at it on a week, a 2 week, maybe even a month basis, and being like, okay, this is where calorie expenditure roughly is at, and this is how I need to modify my eating and potentially even training as well accordingly. And this can be quite beneficial if you are someone that tends to overeat or undereat, or who's someone who is we'll call them an over exerciser. You're like, you just completely underestimate how much exercise you're actually doing. Having like a workout tracker, like again, like Whoop, I quite like. Having something like that where it's like, oh yeah, you're burning way more calories than you thought, right?